All right, gotta mute one of these sources. There we go. All right, sound check. Sound check. See, Farsight's in the house already.
Excellent.
Testing, testing, testing.
How's it going, people?
There was a period of time when C. Farsight was absent, and we would sit here for minutes at a time wondering if our sound was good before somebody realized that he wasn't here, and they were like, oh, sound is good. And then we're like, okay, we better start. It was like, so it's very awkward. It was an awkward time. Okay, dramatic pause for Chris. All right, welcome everybody. CanHammer podcast episode 201. Start of a new era. Thank you everybody for your kind comments and messages that we've received on our last show. First of all, always nice to hear from people who actually listen. Confirm that we're not just talking to space. But also we really appreciate the feedback on what was a bit of a journey of nostalgia last week with Chris on talking about the history of CanHammer. So thanks very much, and for your kind words about keep going and how long we've been doing this. We had some people message us to bring back old fantasy. We had some interesting messages as well. So thanks very much. I'm joined again by my usual hosts, Nick and Francois. How are you guys doing?
Good. How are you?
So, Nick, how old's your kid now? Is it one yet?
No, he's 19 months.
Okay. I'm a bit behind.
So no, he's not one.
So
Almost
not old
two,
enough to play yet, is what you're saying.
Not yet, but he's definitely shown interest when he somehow manages to get into the office and grab at miniatures, that's for sure. So he might be ready at some point.
So speaking of kids, I guess it was maybe a couple weeks ago, they showed this new Warhammer Quest box, which apart from the fact that it has like 40 or 50 or 60 amazing models in it, looks like something that maybe would be cool to play with kids, like a board game / with a bit of Warhammer to it. What do you guys think of that box?
Yeah, for sure. I'm getting one. I actually play full games of 40K with my son. He's almost 10 now, and so he actually gets a little bit of nuance. I help him out, of course, but he's a big fan of board games in general, so I think something like that's going to appeal to him. I played the original Silver Tower from a few years ago with him a few times, and it's good, and it's an introduction to the universe and the lore, and the models look great, so I'm looking forward to painting them.
Is that the one with the old hammer looking witch hunters and undead stuff?
That model is awesome.
I mean, I would probably buy it and it would sit on my shelf and do nothing for years, but I'd be buying it because of the nostalgia of old hammer.
Yeah, I might get it just for that model. Like obviously, I mean, the first thing that comes to your mind is like Inquisitor, but that's just a cool model. So yeah, and it comes with like those like 4 or 5 like villains for the 4 or 5 adventures, and then like 40 something like monsters and shit like that. Like, is really cool. Like, there's a lot of stuff in it. I don't know how much it's gonna cost. Like $250 probably, $300.
$100 billion if you take Pariah Nexus as a measurement.
Probably they're not gonna make enough. So I already got Dan to reserve a copy for me, but yeah, and I don't know when it's coming out. But that looked pretty cool.
Now, if this is the same box that we're talking about, is that the one with the zombies that have like the headstones on their backs?
Correct, yeah.
Okay, that's my only gripe with that one. That's like kind of a bit of the classic oversculpting GW can be prone to. It's just like, who wants to paint 80 zombies with all that detail? Like, it's cool, but it's just like, man, it doesn't need that. I don't want to be spending 4 hours per zombie. But anyway, but they still look good.
Yeah. All right, so before we start on the hobby section of the cast, this is our hobby episode. Just a quick update about the Ontario 40K League. So we were proposing in the executive, which is the fancy name we've given ourselves, that we'd start April 1st. Now, personally, I don't feel like most parts of Ontario can start April 1st, COVID-wise, but people are pretty excited about starting April 1st. So If you have feedback about that, then do feed it back to me about how you feel. I've heard from some people, but not, I mean, we had like 30-something people who wanted to play in this league. So I'd like to hear more feedback before making a final decision as to when we aim to start. One other problem we have, of course, is we have players from across the river, and they're still in freaking curfew.
Yeah.
And obviously we need places like stores to allow us to play because not everybody has tables at home. So I'm going to canvas around the stores and see what they feel as when they're going to allow people to start playing in the stores again, because that's kind of like the main factor. I know not everybody can play in my basement, but so if you have feedback on the starting date and when you feel comfortable to play in the Ottawa division, please feedback to me, please, on the Discord. There's a Discord for the league, or message me or whatever. There's lots of ways of reaching me. All right. So let's get straight to the episode. This is the hobby episode. I can't remember when we last had a hobby episode, actually. Quite some time. Sometimes we talk a bit about hobby, but we don't really have an episode on hobby. And I thought that that would be a super cool thing to start our next 100 podcast series with. And I've actually been super excited to talk about this all day. I've been thinking about it, writing notes. And so how about you guys, being as excited as me?
Yeah, of course, especially since we can't actually play. I've been painting a lot and thinking about painting and excited about painting. So it's nice that we're talking about something we're actually doing.
Well, yeah, and that's the one way we're interacting with the whole hobby right now is mainly painting and assembling. So, yeah, it's exciting to talk about. We can talk about meta all we want, but there is no meta as much as people want to say there is.
The meta, is the Australian meta is the meta.
The Australian meta,
exactly.
There's the Art of War Florida meta, and that's about it. So,
4 guys in a house meta, yeah.
So we can't play, and there's actually nothing coming out soon. I think Drukari maybe end of March, it seems like, is the rumor.
March 27th.
So, might as well talk about hobby. Okay, so we're gonna have a little bit of a structured. I've sent you guys a few kind of questions, but of course we can talk all around these things as much as we want. We'll try not to get into too many super deep rabbit holes. The first thing I want to say before we start is that the podcast is not sponsored by any hobby companies or manufacturers. Nobody sends us paints. Nobody sends us brushes. We don't have airbrush deals. None of us, all three of us, none of us are hobby, sponsored people. So all of our opinions.
But if you are a manufacturer,
we welcome it.
Feel free to send these things for free.
We're happy to try things out for you if you'd like. But none of us have any stake in the game, so if we give recommendations, it's based purely on our own preference and uses.
It's where our money's going.
The other thing to say is maybe, except occasionally on Nick's side, none of us are commission painters or anything like that. So we're not giving you tips or things to get your business or anything. This is just 3 dudes talking about painting, often not very well or extremely fast. And so those are the disclaimers. Okay. So at the end, we're going to talk about what we're actually doing right now. But so the first question I put out to you guys was, what is your favorite paint range or brand or specific paint that you can't live without for both brush and airbrush? Let's start with Francois.
So that's a tough question because I actually use about 4 or 5 different paint ranges. I still use a lot of Citadel paints because that's kind of what I quote unquote grew up with in the hobby. And you start painting, you watch Duncan videos, and you end up buying a bunch of Citadel paints. So I have a lot of those, and I'm used to them, and I use a lot.
You know what the colors look like, right?
Exactly. And I have my go-tos. Like I know if I need a nice gray, Mechanicum Standard gray is going to do the job for me, things like that. But as I developed as a painter, I branched out into other ranges, and I have a little bit of Army Painter. I will say I'm not a huge fan of Army Painter. I find the consistency of the paint a little too thick for me, and it requires a little bit of manipulation to get right. A lot of Vallejo, which I like a lot. For the airbrush, I mostly use Vallejo because I just out of laziness bought the entire Vallejo Air
box,
range.
right? The box
and while
with
I
the lid
do
and everything.
And while I do airbrush with all sorts of paints, including non-airbrush paints. It's super easy to do. You just dial it a little bit. As I was starting learning the airbrush, it was just a confidence booster for me to use the Vallejo Air range because I could just pour it in and start spraying. Recently, I've become a big fan of Scale 75, which is a really nice paint. It's not as, it doesn't cover as much as the other paints I've talked about so far. So you do have to go back and do more coats maybe with it than you're maybe used to. It's good for blending colors as well. And for metallics, right now, Scale 75 is my go-to.
Yeah. So before we go to you, Nick, I just want to talk about GW paints for a second. So I also grew up with GW paints because if you want to paint like the picture on the box and get the same colors, they tell you exactly what paints to get. So naturally, unless you're a hobby expert, the first paints you're going to get as a budding artist are the GW paints, right? And they generally perform quite well for what they're designed to do. And you follow the instructions and you get, the results that you get. I gotta say, and like you, Francois, I use a lot of Citadel because I don't want to figure out what of this range is similar to. Like I spent an hour trying to figure out what green was similar to Caliban green, right? And so, whereas if I just had Caliban green, then I wouldn't have to figure that out. My biggest gripe with GW paints and with their airbrush range is the bottles.
Oh, so I transferred all of mine into
because you got so much time apparently.
It took me a day, but it saved me a lot of grief later. I just bought a bunch of dropper bottles on Amazon, and I got little funnels, and I just transferred all my
doing
paints.
that, and I just won't. And
and after that, you can just rip the label off the GW pot and stick it on your dropper bottle.
When are they going to change to dropper bottles? Like, I'm sorry, like it just has to be done.
So the tinfoil hat wearer in me says never, because those pots that they use are great at wasting paint, and so they sell more.
Yeah, it's just like and you got anyway. Okay, so Nick, do you have a go-to range? I know you favor some ranges over others.
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna mimic what you guys say about the GW Citadel range. So I don't want us to give the impression that this is a bad range. Like if you're
it's a good range.
New to the hobby. Yeah, if you're new to the hobby and you're just getting started and you go to a GW, your local game store, and they have GW paints and you want to use those, go ahead. You could feasibly spend your whole hobby career just using GW paints. They're perfectly fine for most applications. It's just, I don't know, out of enjoying spending money and trying new things, I guess I like to try other ranges. So my go-to, and I tell you a couple reasons why, is actually Pro Acryl by Monument Hobbies. This is, I think, kind of like a newer paint range on the market last couple of years. Don't quote me on that. And I found this range at LVO. I went by Creature Caster / Monument Hobbies stand, and they showed me the paints, and I liked the colors and whatever else. And I thought, heck, why not? And honestly, right now, that's what I start with, and everything has just turned into an accessory to that
brush
range.
and
I'll tell you
airbrush?
why. Yeah, and that's one of my biggest reasons why I enjoy that. So when Francois was mentioning, uses Vallejo Game Air, right, because it's easier, whatever else, and I just remember times when I was using the Vallejo ranges, and I'd use Game Air, and then you make a mistake when you go on to do your brush, but then you always came up to this problem of trying to match the color of the airbrushed paint with the brush on paint, the color and the whether it's a satin texture or whether it's a matte finish or whatever, the color and finish, you always had a hard time matching between the airbrush and brush. At least that's what I found. So I found the Pro Acryl paints, whether you use them on a brush or through your airbrush, and they're pretty effortless to put through your airbrush. The finish and the color is the exact same. So if I do some airbrushing and I need to touch up a spot with the brush, you wouldn't even be able to tell. They thin super well. They're just an excellent paint range. But like you guys, I've used like a number. Like I have Green Stuff World, Army Painter. Hey, look, I haven't used their whole range. And like Francois, I found them to be very thick. But unlike other paints that can be thick, like Scale 75, these don't. I didn't find the Army Painters thinned well. I found that they actually break up quite a bit, and it's hard to get the consistency you want. And I've fought way too much with them. So yeah, Vallejo bunch. But yeah, if I had to choose, just if you were to tell me you can only use one paint range right now to do all your painting, it would
Yeah,
be Pro
yeah.
Acryl.
So
I'll just jump in here and say, for our listeners, any paint it can be an airbrush paint. Don't feel like you have to use an air paint,
Yeah,
because any paint you can put into your airbrush and then add some flow improver. I prefer flow improver to thinner, but whatever works for you, and you can turn that into an airbrush paint. I started with Vallejo Air because when I first started airbrushing, I just wanted a shortcut. But nowadays, I actually airbrush with regular paints all the time.
So
Yep.
I picked up some Pro Aqua at your recommendation, mostly for a search for Caliban Green, and I quite like it through the airbrush. It's pretty nice. I haven't tried to brush it yet, so that's something I'll try. My one gripe, first of all, it's hard to get. I think only Cody sells it in like all of Canada.
Yeah.
Number one,
Yeah, yeah.
and then Cody at Hooded Goblin. Check it out if you want Pro Aqua paints. And then the topper screw system that they have leaves a little drop of paint at the top, which just seems wasteful. But anyway, that's a small gripe.
That's a workflow thing you have to get used to. Yeah, I agree. It's like I open it and close it, and just now it's muscle memory that I just wipe the tip on a napkin or something as I put it away, because yeah, there's always
Yeah.
a little bit.
Yeah,
Yeah. But anyways, that's kind of a little nuisance. But otherwise, the
So,
paint's
question
pretty
on
good.
on the floor from Lady Space Patrol, cool name. What percentage of the job do you think you can complete exclusively with airbrush? Well, I think that depends on your skill level, basically.
Yeah, it depends how good you are, what kind of airbrushes you have.
It depends how fast you want to get through an army. If you're asking me, I'm going to tell you 100%.
I've seen people in a 28 mil model do like
Yeah,
facial
it's crazy
details
what
with their
people do,
airbrush.
yeah.
I mean, I don't do that, but so you can do feasibly
Yeah.
quite a bit. I mean, per model, if you're talking about an army, I mean, this is a bit of a, down the rabbit hole bit, but if just buying an airbrush to do base coating,
Saves you a
it's worth
ton
it.
of time.
And if you don't do anything else with your airbrush and just base coat with
You're
it,
still
you've
saving.
already made.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
But my Necron army is pretty much 100%
Yep.
airbrush.
So I think actually a great way
Yeah,
to
me
start
too.
airbrushing is to base like prime, maybe zenithals. These are really good ways of seeing light in a new way, and also a great way of getting used to spraying through the airbrush without worrying about like accuracy. And then maybe starting to put on base coats onto large surfaces like marine armor, guns, stuff like that. So you can start to work on how close you can get, and airbrush control. And then, like Nick said, if you're really good, you could almost paint the whole freaking model with an airbrush. But
you can do eye glow on Necron warriors with an airbrush, which is what I'm doing for mine. Those are not hand painted. It's basically just my Sotar 2020, and I spray the eye glow around the
Yeah,
eyes.
the
Yeah.
Sotar, yeah.
That's a specialized model. Don't buy the Sotar
Yeah,
as your
yeah.
first airbrush.
Yeah, do not. I ruined mine. That was my first airbrush, and I ruined it. So do
that
not
was
do
my first airbrush because it was $50 from the Badger birthday sale. And it was like
Oh, yeah.
normally like whatever $300 or whatever. So I'm like, I'll just get the most expensive brush for $50. Okay, so so last year, 2020, was my hobby exploration year because there was nothing else going on, and so my goal was to go past the GW system. So I actually dabbled in a lot of different mediums and a lot of different paint. Like I have a stupid number of paints now, unfortunately, which I probably won't use most of them. But in terms of brush painting, other than Chimera, which I've been playing with a lot, which is kind of like pure, I don't know what to call it, pure pigment paints, which is for mixing, like you mix everything, which is really cool, but probably you wouldn't want to do this on a full GW army. But so I've been dabbling with that sort of paint. But I really, really like for brushwork now, like non-metallic, is the model color line. I think the paints are there's so many cool colors, and they obviously nice dropper bottle, and they cover really well. So if you're trying to do something without putting 2 or 3 coats on, they have good coverage. The model color black is the best covering black. Like GW black struggles to cover often unless you glob it on. Model color black covers everything. It's really good. For brush metallics, I agree with Francois. Scale 75 metallics, so good for brush on metallics, also good through airbrush. And the other metallic line that I've discovered recently is the acrylic metal, a Vallejo metal line. you can brush it and it goes through the airbrush with no problem. There's, I don't know, 10 different kinds of silver. I personally can't tell the difference. When I put them all out on the palette, I'm like, they all look exactly the same. But they all have different hues, and I don't know. But
Oh yeah, those I've heard a lot about.
Yeah.
Apparently, really good. I've been using the Pro Acryl metallics. I like them, but
Yeah,
I've heard
like-
a lot about those ones.
That said, the Games Workshop metallics, the Citadel paints, most of them are pretty good. I'm a big fan of Retributor armor if you're
Same.
looking for that shade of
Yeah.
like kind of bronze, and you know, Lead Belcher is decent as well.
Yeah. I dabbled in oil paints. I don't do as much as that anymore because it's kind of messy. I've got some of the Scale 75 like heavy acrylic paints. And I'll come over onto some other stuff that I've been dabbling with later on. But I think it's, if you've got the resources and you've got like a store that sells a bunch of different lines, which we do in Ottawa actually, nicely. It's nice, especially if you can't quite get the color you want or you want to try some different things. Just buy a few pots. And you know what? Like, they're also mostly cheaper than GW as well.
An experiment. That's the key to painting. Just find what works for you.
Okay, so there's a question on the chat about brushes. So that will be the next question, actually. Do you guys have a favorite type of brush or brand, or like, what are you guys using for brushwork?
I use Winsor and Newton for my fine brushwork. Winsor and Newton Series 7. I really like those. If I'm doing more batch work, which is most of what I do actually, I'll go to a cheaper brush usually, even though if you take good care of them, your Winsor and Newton, if you use brush soap and all that, they will last you a long time and you'll get your money's worth. For if I'm batch painting like a bunch of Tyranid gaunts and I'm just going fast, I'll go with cheaper brushes. I have some synthetics, I have some cheaper sable hair brushes, but if I'm trying to put my best effort forward, my favorite brushes are the Winsor and Newton Series 7.
Yeah. Nick?
Yeah, to be honest, I'm not entirely sure what my favorites. Actually, if I can tell you my favorite, and it's going to be shocking, it's actually just cheap synthetic brushes. One reason is because the cheap synthetics is synthetic brushes, you get a certain kind of stiffness to the bristles that sable you don't. And if you get used to it, I find it easier to manipulate and, you know, be precise with your brush strokes. Of course, the downside is they don't hold as much paint. And then you get like this curling that can happen at the tip. So
Yeah.
you don't want to like find your favorite cheap one and then buy a lot of those. You don't want to spend a lot of money on because it doesn't matter how well you take care of them. That's going to happen.
Yeah, you'll be throwing them out.
You'll be throwing them out, and then they just like they start off as your fine detail, and then shortly after they're your large
dry
detail.
brushing.
Then you're dry brushing, then they're terrain, and then you use them to unclog the sink or the toilet. But other than that, like I do like sable brushes. I think if I had to pick one, but it's been a while since I've used them, is Winsor and Newton. But I've used that like 5-6 years ago, and it's only in the last year where it's like I had to replace it. So like Francois said, if you want a good brush that'll last you a long time, Winsor and Newton. I heard there's other brands as well. I also have Artis Opus. Is that what it's called?
Yeah.
Artis
Yeah.
Opus?
Yeah.
I find those are okay. They're expensive like those type of sable brushes are. I'm not sold on it, to be honest, in terms of being my favorite sable brush. Yeah, but I use it and it works fine. I think right now my preference, if I'm choosing between the sable brushes I have, is I just bought like Darren, I buy like a lot of odds and ends just to try and experiment with different things. So I did that with Monument Hobbies. I bought one of their sable brushes and one of their synthetic sable brushes. They're both good and they're both kind of relatively inexpensive. And for like that 90% job, their sable brush is quite good. I'm not telling the throngs of people out there to just go and buy Monument Hobbies, but I enjoy it.
Go and buy Monument Hobbies.
There's well, the Pro Kill, hands down, I'm telling you to do that. Their brushes, you might find a better one. And then the synthetic, I mean, I like their synthetic, but it's still like a $10 synthetic brush versus you can go to Michael's or wherever and get a $3 synthetic brush.
Get them for $2 or $3. Yeah, I will add that if you are spending good money on brushes and you're buying a high quality sable brush, you want to take care of it.
Yes.
And you don't want to be using it for just anything. Like, for the love of God, don't dip that thing into a Grelin Earth or any of those like technical
don't do that.
paints.
Do
Don't
not.
do that.
Yeah.
Don't let the paint get into the metal part of the ferrule.
Yeah.
Take care of it with brush soap. You can buy brush soap for super cheap on Amazon, and it will keep your brush going for basically, like, I paint a lot, and I don't think I've replaced my Winsor and Newton brush set in years.
Yeah, I still have my Winsor Newton. I still pull it out once in a while.
Yeah,
for
they got
details
hard
and
to
stuff.
find
Like, it's
during
been
the pandemic. So when I did find them, I bought like 4 of them, and I bought a size 0 because I find for 28 millimeter models, I could paint the whole entire model with size 0, with airbrush for base coating and stuff. But even eyes, if you have a nice brush and you keep a nice tip on it, you can do this finest detail with a size 0. You like,
You can
yeah, you can
do it with
a
a
1
one or
too.
even a
Yeah,
two.
yeah.
Honestly, if you have a good tip and you take care of your brush, a bigger brush will give you more control because there's more paint in it, and so it doesn't dry as fast. And when the tip of your brush starts drying, it's when you start running into trouble.
So I gotta say, I have the Artist Opus, I have Winsor Newton, I have a bunch of other ones. There's really hard to tell a difference, and really I think they're all good. And it's just a personal preference, what fits your hand better. What you like in terms of like if you do like weird techniques and stuff, what kind of suits what you do. So you can spend a lot or you can not spend a lot, but if you have I guess the message is if you have a nice few sizes of a nice Kolinsky sable is good. If you look after it, you'll paint everything with those and it'll last you a long time, and doesn't.
Yeah, I gotta echo that. Sorry, I made it like seem like the Artist Opus was bad. No, it's not bad. I guess what I'm trying to communicate, it's not like I wasn't like this is the brush. It's like, yeah, if you like that brush, it's gonna work for you. If you like the Winsor Newton, it's gonna work for you. If you like the Rosemary Company one,
but you get a nice wooden box with
it. You do. So it makes me feel bad when I use them.
I know. I just like to keep them in
now,
the box because it keeps them safe.
and they're white. They're white handles, which I don't like because you can see it stain, as you. So it's like, if they were black, I wouldn't mind as much. But now, because they're white, they're starting to stain a bit.
Okay, I don't want to dive in too much into differences between different airbrushes and brands. Why don't you just tell the viewers and the listeners what airbrush you use, and maybe like one reason why.
I alternate between.
Oh, so you're already
and
breaking the
Badger.
rules, Francois.
I know, but I think if you're gonna start with a good workhorse airbrush. So I use a Badger 105. This is kind of one of the regular recommendations for people just starting out. But a bunch of different brands will do Iwata. There's a ton, Patriot, whatever. I have a Badger 105 that I use for all my big stuff. So I prime with it, I base coat with it. If I have to paint an entire wing on the Hive Tyrant, I'll use that. And then if I go into detail work, I break out the Sotar 2020. That's a very fine detail airbrush that you only want to use for fine detail. You don't want to use that for big panels because you will regret that decision. But yeah, Badger 105 is where you should probably start, or something around those lines. Don't buy a $300 airbrush to start. That's not a good idea.
Bend it and stuff.
You'll probably ruin it. Yeah.
Like I did. I had the Sotar. Okay, story 6 years ago. I had the Sotar first one. I was like, yes, it's gonna be great. It was hellish. I couldn't get it to work. Always fighting with it. And then at one point, also don't use ammonia cleaners for your airbrush. I didn't know that. Yeah, hot tip. So at one point, I went to go clean it and let it soak in an ammonia cleaner because I went online. They're like, oh, let it soak in the cleaner, but forgot to mention not ammonia cleaners. But then I went away for work for a week and I came back and the whole thing was corroded and destroyed. And I was like, well, garbage.
So
I think that's kind of a normal story for new airbrush users. When you start, you're going to be fighting with it for a while until you
get an airbrush with a decent sized needle that's not too small, and start with big stuff like we already said, right? So I also start with the Patriot 105, and that's still what I have. I have a second one now. I think it's the Extreme. I don't know what the difference is, but and I use that for basically everything. And I rarely use the Sotar because it's so finicky. And I think Badger also, we have a lot of Badger stockists in Ottawa, so we can get parts. And also, hot tip, if you want a starting airbrush and not spend a lot of money on it, then follow Badger Facebook page. Every year on their birthday, they sell any airbrush for $50.
That's coming around soon, eh?
Actually, let me disappoint you guys. It should have come around like 6 weeks ago, and
Oh
they're not doing it this year because of the
no.
pandemic.
Okay. Okay.
I was waiting to get a SOTAR to
So
see for
what
that.
what they said was they may do it late when I guess their production gets back up to full or whatever. But they are not. If they have skipped their
Okay.
usual
Okay.
time
Well,
slot
excluding
for
this
FDC.
year, you can get any Badger airbrush for $50, which is a deal even on the cheap ones. So that's a great way of picking up your first airbrush. You could even buy two, in case you wrecked the first one. So
Like me.
yeah. So and then like once you know what you want from your airbrush, then go buy something else. But that's a great way to getting your first airbrush for $50. It's really good.
I've since graduated to the Iwata HP CS. It's kind of like I think a .35 needle, and it's an airbrush, and it works well. And I mean, I got that because when I first started getting back in the hobby, like whatever it was, 7 years, whenever we all kind of got back into it, and I jumped at airbrushing, it was next level painting. I was following him, Kenny Boucher, and that was the one that he was using and recommended. And you know what? It's been quite good. I've been looking to graduate like you guys, big brain painters here, to like a Sotar style or like what's the Heider and Steinbeck or the Infinity whatever. But I just haven't pulled the trigger on those yet.
It's a lot of money actually too. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay, so
it
next
is.
question. 3 things, tools, paints, whatever, accessories, 3 things that you use all the time and you could not do without. Nick.
Oh, okay. I think we're going like, is this painting exclusively
hobby.
painting? Oh, for hobby.
Yeah, which is like painting or converting, like whatever. Like 3 things that you would say everybody needs to buy or needs to try or that you use all the time. Okay. Do you need more time?
Why don't you guys? Yeah, you guys start. Sorry.
Okay, Francois, you go.
Okay,
first.
so I'll go super basic because some of our listeners may need to start at the very beginning, and then Nick can take it to a more advanced technique. Maybe I will say, get magnets. Magnets are so useful. Even if it's just to stick under your model's bases, you can carry them on a cookie tray. Magnets will change your life. Obviously, magnetizing weapons saves you money, and you can swap out loadouts and stuff like that. Learn to love the magnet. That's number one for me. I go through so many magnets in a normal hobby month. Beyond that, if you're going to be doing any conversions, get yourself a nice Japanese saw or hobby saw or whatever it's called. I think on Amazon, if you type Japanese saw, it'll come up. Basically, really fine tooth saws that lets you make super narrow cuts. So if you want to cut, I don't know, the bolter fist of a Marine, you can make a really straight and narrow cut and then replace it with something else. That's another tool that I could not do without. And for my third, I'll go off the wall and tell you all about my newest love, the 3D printer. I have a resin 3D printer that has basically been running 24/7 for the last couple of months in my spare bedroom, and I've been printing bits.
I also love your printer.
Proxies, and I printed a bunch of bits for Darren for his new Dark Angel army. It's just, especially if you want to convert an army, there's a world of possibilities out there where you can just find STL files and print your own shields or helmets or weapons or jump packs or whatever you want. Smoke trails for Inceptors. I have Inceptors here that have 3D printed smoke trails. So rather than the flimsy flight stand underneath, they have smoke coming out of their jump packs, and it just makes them look so much better. Now, that, of course, is a very advanced tool, and it's super finicky, and it's not cheap, and the resin is toxic, so don't jump into it without doing your research. You need to spend a lot of time on YouTube watching tutorials before you jump into 3D printing, but it's probably the best thing I ever bought for my hobby.
All right. Okay, Nick, are you ready? Okay.
Yeah, and I'm gonna test Francois because we hear about his 3D printer. I think every day, 3 times a day, of what's happening now. So he really enjoys that 3D printer. I personally will never get into it. Well, I'll never say never, but he definitely enjoys it. Okay, So things I can't go without. I'm not going to say any hobby stuff because I honestly I don't like building the models and I don't like converting. I just want to get those things
Oh yeah,
built
yeah,
so I
painting.
can
You mean?
paint
Yeah,
them.
painting.
Yeah, yeah. So painting, okay, these aren't necessities, but definitely if you're looking to up your game beyond just slapping paint on the models, things we're considering. The wet palette, I find, I mean, everybody's going to tell you this. This is not like a new tip here. You're not learning anything new, but a wet palette. And the reason is there's just something a bit divine about being able to maintain moisture in your paint, being able to mix the paint on the palette and see the colors and see the transitions, and being able to have that work over a session. And like, I can tell immediately the difference. Like sometimes I won't use it because I want to quickly throw on a color because I have 10 minutes to get into a paint, and I'll use just a regular palette. And already, like it takes just a couple of minutes, and I already start to feel like the difference and get annoyed that I didn't just use my wet
Yeah.
palette because it took literally no effort to use it, but I'm lazy. So definitely the wet palette. We've already spoken about airbrushes, but honestly, an airbrush is the next thing. Like if you have, I mean, you can get them fairly cheap. Some of them you can get fairly cheap. You can probably get them used. If you have the space to dedicate to an airbrush and you have like the motivation to improve in your painting, if at least just the workflow, I think the airbrush 100% is a necessity. And then third is would be because most people listening to this are the painting miniatures paint acrylic paints. Like Marco Frazzoni is probably not listening to this to get tips, you know, and how Raldez isn't. The people that are listening to this probably should hear this is get oil paints, and not because you should paint your whole model using oil paints, but if only just to create washes. Now, GW makes great washes. I don't like the Army Painter ones, but people like those washes, but you can definitely make different styles of washes and excellent washes using oil paints, like with white spirits and like I have Winsor and Newton, but there's all kinds, and that's definitely can up. Those are like I think three things that can up your painting game at least if you don't have those.
Yeah, oils are really good for weathering tanks as well. For big flat panels, most of my Talarn tanks are painted using oil washes, and it's like
Yeah, I
magic.
mean, we won't dive too far into oils, but if you want to check out a new medium that can really change some things that you do, then do check out oils. And there's great YouTube channels. Marco was, we'll talk about that later. But okay, so my three things, other than getting an airbrush. So I agree, wet palette, game changer. I mean, when I transitioned to wet palette, I was using less paint. You could store your paint between sessions without getting more out. And you can mix. It's more. It just changes everything. So getting or making a good wet palette, it's game changer. And I had a small one before, and now I got one of the big massive ones because now I'm like mixing and stuff like that. So
Yeah, you don't need to
you
buy
can
one.
make
You
one.
can
Yeah,
take a Tupperware
yeah.
container and
There's
some
plenty of
scrub towel
videos.
and
Yeah.
some big.
Yeah, so wet palette. I think if you're still using palette paper, dry palette, like you gotta go wet palette. That's just yeah. So and then if we're talking the other two things that I use on literally every single model that I paint, so Molotow Black, boom, Molotow Black, one for all acrylic in this big bottle. You pour it straight into your airbrush. I prime everything with this. It goes on silky smooth. It's nice and matte. It never obscures detail. Airbrushes with no additives. You just stick it in your airbrush, spray. Stick it in, spray. I sometimes spent, like, the longest I spent with this was like an hour and a half just priming like 100 models. And it just kept going in. And this is my original bottle. It's not even half empty. So Molotow Black, so good. And that was from Marco, actually, because that's what he uses. And then my number two thing that I use on almost every single model that goes right on top of the Molotow Black is Liquitex white ink. So this is what I zenithal with, basically. I find a black prime with a white zenithal a pretty easy way of starting every single model in your army. It adds a lot of texture to your paint job, and nothing easier than spraying ink. I mean, you don't have to dilute it or do anything. And, you know, spraying white paint is sometimes a pain in the ass. It speckles, and it's really hard to spray white paint. But spraying white ink is easy, super easy. You don't have to do anything to it; it just sprays on beautifully. So that's another thing that this is my fourth bottle because I use so much white ink. And there's many other uses for white ink too. Like you want to do highlights, you want to support a color that you want to put on top of another color, you spray white ink first. Like it's got so many uses, but just as a thing that you put on a zenithal on top of your black primer, it's like, yeah, go through a lot of white ink. All right, those are my three. Okay, let's move along. So 3 hobby tricks or techniques that you've learned recently. Let's go, Francois.
So I've got a list here. So I'll piggyback on what you just said because this year. So let me give some context. In this year of the pandemic, I have painted more than I've ever painted, and I've painted 4.
You've painted more than
armies.
Anybody ever painted.
I painted a full White Scars army, a full Harlequin army, a full Necron army, and a full Deathwing army. So I've painted like over 10,000 points, and I added to my Tyranids too. So over 10,000 points of painting. But one of the things so I'm going to go through things I discovered painting those armies. And the first army that I painted, my first pandemic army, was my White Scars. And as you may imagine, that involves painting a lot of white power armor. And that's not easy. White is one of those notoriously hard colors to get right, because if you just spray pure white on a model, it looks wrong. It will not look natural. So for my White Scars, what I ended up discovering was white inks. And in fact, the same ink you're using, titanium white. And the trick is to start from a gray. So I primed gray, and then I built up the white ink over top. But even that is not quite enough. In order to get a good white, you need to make it not look flat, which is hard. So you have 2 options there. You can take the long route, which is to build it up from gray and do a bunch of shading and highlighting. You can even throw in some greens, and sometimes it looks really good. But that's not my thing. My thing is banging out an army in 3 weeks. So I experimented with building up from gray and doing all sorts of shading with the airbrush. And I was like, this is taking too long. I'm never going to get this army on the table. So instead, I went from pure gray primer to white ink on top. And then the trick is to weather it. So you take a sponge, and then you just break it up. So we used to get these sponges in the back of blister packs. You don't really get them that way anymore. And I'm showing my age now. But that kind of very fine sponge that you can then rip up, and then you dip it in brown paint. You remove most of it like you would for a dry brush, and then you very gently dab it on top of the panels. And this mimics paint chipping. And just that will give your model depth, because all of a sudden it's not a flat white panel anymore. There's stuff breaking it up. You then follow it up with a very careful pin wash, meaning you just wash the recesses. You don't wash the whole panel. You just drop the wash into the recesses. If you want to do it properly, you do it with a gloss varnish and an oil wash. But again, it takes too long, so my ghetto method is just to have a very steady hand.
Oil works perfect for that.
Well, exactly. That's what I said. The right way to do it is with you gloss varnish and then you oil wash and you let the capillary action do its thing. That takes too long. So what I prefer to do is use my very steady hand and just drop none oil into the recesses. Do it. And
wait. So just gloss varnishing your army and then dipping it in oil wash is too long.
No.
So
No. That's not what you do. If you want to do it the proper way, is you gloss varnish and then you still pin wash. You don't dip it in, because otherwise you'll stain the panels. Don't put words in my mouth, Nick. It's the extra step of making your. All right. Thanks, guys. Anyway, painting white is hard, and the trick is to give it depth by weathering. So that's number 1 for me. Number 2, I'll use a much shorter example. So the second pandemic army that I painted was my Necrons, and I didn't want to do the traditional green glow Necrons, so I decided to do a frozen Necron thing. Actually, I wanted it to be glowing blue, but my blue came out looking kind of Arctic a little bit, and so I decided to lean into that and do snow bases. And so I learned how to do snow bases, and snow bases are so easy. Do not buy any kind of technical snow paint. Don't do it. It's expensive for no reason. What you do is you take equal parts white paint, PVA glue, and baking soda. And then you adjust your ratio depending on exactly what texture you want, but it's roughly 1 to 1 to 1. Mix that up, glob it on, and it looks like snow on the base. So that was a nice little discovery journey I went through.
You should make a YouTube video about
snow
that.
bases. We've been talking about that, and I keep putting it off.
Oh, really?
Yes,
Somebody asked you to do that? Oh, okay. I can't remember.
Oh, well, funny you mentioned that. I'm looking at buying webcams to do hobby videos. So
Maybe there may be hobby content coming up on the channel.
Yeah.
Who knows? Who knows? No promises, but maybe.
And then the third technique that I discovered semi-recently, I guess this is a pre-pandemic one, but oil washes did change my life when it came to painting tanks, because I have a lot of Imperial Guard over here. And if you have big flat panels with rivets that you want to quickly and efficiently weather so they look good, oil washes will change your life. They're much easier to work with once you've done all the prep work than actual GW washes on flat panels.
The GW washes don't work well on flat panels. You get all sorts of streaking, and it just doesn't work well.
GW washes are for what you would consider organic
with texture. Like fur. Yeah.
It's really good for that kind
skin.
of stuff. Yeah. Okay, Nick, top 3 techniques or tips?
The top 3 techniques and tips that I would say that I've been kind of refining lately. One would be wet blending. I'm kind of like a little opposite to Francois in the sense he likes to bust out armies super quickly,
You're the complete opposite.
Yeah, I try. And it gets worse and worse, especially with the Death Guard. I spend way too much time on them, and I'm still never happy. Blah blah blah. Anyways, so and my Grey Knights. So I spent a lot of time wet blending the highlights on my Grey Knights, and that's basically a technique where you're using wet paint, and you're using 2 tones, and at the same time you put those tones on the model and you blend them on the model to make a smooth transition. And it's a little bit more than that, but that's kind of the gist of it. So that's one technique I've been working on, and it's I wouldn't say it's something that you want to do on a 4,000 point Necron army. In fact, I just finished painting a Necron army, and I forced myself to channel my inner Francois, because I was like, okay, I'm buying Necrons, and I'm not gonna spend 1,000 years painting stupid Necrons. I'm not, because they're metal guys. So I did what Francois did. I chose the green glow, so I even went lazier than Francois. I went green glow, and I basically just sprayed them with the dark metal from Pro Acryl. They all got dipped oil wash. Then they all got green glow guns, and one detail here and there, a base, and done. And it honestly, it bothered my brain.
So satisfying, isn't it, though, to put an entire army on the table?
Yeah, I mean, yes, because it's record time. In the actual amount of time it took to paint them, I think I've spent units of Death Guard versus this whole army. So, definitely that's satisfying. And to be honest, when you look at it on the table, I was actually quite impressed at how it looks just from a playing perspective. If you look at it like this, it's kind of trash. But so anyways, wet blending is the one. Filtering actually is the other one I've been experimenting with. And so filtering is essentially, how I would define it or explain it is you're using one color to try to change the hue of another color. So say you've put down a red on your cloak and you're like, I want to give that a bit more, make it a bit more burgundy or whatever. Then you can thin down a purple. It could be an ink or, really thin acrylic paint or whatever. And you can lightly kind of it's like a glaze, but with the airbrush, you can glaze that over the red to change the hue. And it can help if you're airbrushing and you put your dark color and your really bright color, and you sometimes that transition's a little garish, you can actually use the filter kind of even out that transition between your dark and your light color. So I've been actually working on a lot of filtering. I did that on Mortarion recently, a number of stuff, actually the Grey Knights.
And sometimes it's really surprising what you get, right? Like how yellow looks best over a pink base. Like you wouldn't think that, but it's
Oh
one of
yeah,
those. It's
100%. Yeah,
one of those
use
things.
yellow on magenta. If you filter
Yeah.
yellow on a magenta and you let the recesses alone and you just continue adding yellow to your
Yeah.
values, then you end up with like an orange recess and like it's just looks like a naturally,
Well, that's
darkened
what I did
yellow.
on
Yeah,
my
it's
my yellow jet
anyways.
bikes, right? Like,
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, exactly what you did there. So that's that one. And actually, the third technique is not really a painting technique. It's more of a project technique. So historically, I'm kind of just put the model on the table, base it, and I just jump into painting. Like I don't even think. Sometimes I'm just like, okay, this part is blue, so I grab blue and I start painting blue, and I don't really plan the model, and I kind of just go with it as it, kind of work with it, and like mistakes I correct, blah blah blah. And most of the time they come out fine, but I find what I've been doing lately is trying to plan what the model's going to look like, what colors, especially when you're looking at an army. And I did that with my Grey Knights. Like those were the ones who were like, okay, if I want an army to be like, this is going to maybe challenge for painting war, it's going to be Grey Knights because there's not so many models. But what I did different with them, not only spending more time on like blending them, but was actually planning how I was going to tackle that army. So like I wanted this type of green to contrast with this type of red, and this would be this color, and these would be this color, so that it would unify the army and would like it would really pop the models when you look at them. And so I find that was one technique that kind of I learned over the pandemic is just you can take some time to plan. And I did that with the Necrons as well, actually. Part of like getting past that I don't need to, wet blend every stupid model is I could say, okay, how are these Necrons going to look good but with less time? It's like, well, the green part of the glow is really going to pop in contrast with this red. I use like pigments, dry pigments on the base, and that kind of those different textures and the green glow and the dark armor all helps add contrast and interest visually. So that's kind of one thing if you're out there and if you were like me, try putting a little bit more planning steps into your projects and you might be surprised about what comes out.
And remember that people look at your models from 4 feet away and not six
Yeah.
inches.
Yes,
I always
that's
look at
another
yours
thing.
at 6 inches, Russell, because I know what's hidden.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, it's funny. It's depressing, and I think I've said this story before. But like, all I've spent, like, I put my Thousand Suns on the table, and I wanted them to be like my labor of love, but they were literally just gold and teal. Where I had the wash turn out glossy mistakenly, but it worked, whatever. And then I had this other model. I painstakingly painted it, and I'd go to tournaments, and people would be like, "Man, I love your demon prints," and it took me 2 hours to paint them. I just sprayed them gold, washed them, added like a detail or two, and they kind of like ignored the other model I'd spent so much time.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's not always like, wet blending that gets the eye. Some people just, a lot of people just like high contrast, bright colors,
Okay, so this year I learned quite a number of things. The first thing I learned was how to swap colors in my airbrush really fast, because that was always a super onerous part of airbrushing. Was like, okay, now I need to go this color, then this color, and
hot
like
swap.
it's such a pain in the ass. And it was really a lot simpler than I thought. All I had to do was rinse it out with some water, rinse it out with a little bit of cleaner, and I was good to go. And before, I was going to the sink and scrubbing it, and every time, and it was such a pain in the ass. And when I let go of that slightly obsessive like part of it, and it just got really fast. And so that was like a big efficiency changer in my airbrushing. Even swapping between black and white, because you don't want any black in your white, or you don't want any white in your black. It was as easy as that. And part of that is like the paints that you use, obviously, like easy to clean out. But some of it is just like, have faith, like do the clean, and then just keep going. So that changed things a lot. Okay, and then the other two things so this year I started dabbling in bust painting, which is a completely different kind of painting than painting miniatures. But and I started dabbling in that, and people saw me working on the samurai, which is now sitting on the shelf because I got a new bust. But and so I really and the point of painting the bust was to improve not only use of the brush work and brush technique, but also in how to see the light, and also contrast, and you can apply that to your 28 millimeter miniatures as well, obviously on a smaller scale. So I delve into brush, and so the two things I learned really about painting like larger scale models like that is I've been practicing what's called the loaded brush technique that kind of Ben Comets kind of popularized or invented. I don't know who invented it, and which is basically you put your one color in your brush and then you put a highlight color just on the tip, and then by varying your pressure, you basically do a blend as you paint. It's pretty tricky, actually. Yeah. It's extremely tricky, but it's cool when it works. It's like, whoa, I just did all that in like one move.
Very effective if you get it. Yeah, if you do it well.
Yeah, and I wish I had the discipline to get like a piece of paper and just practice it over and over again, but I don't. But so that's a cool technique I've been working on. And then the other thing that I've been using a lot on my models, but also on the samurai model, and that I will be painting soon, my Uncle Number 4 bust, which there's a good story behind this, which I'm going to be revealing on Just Put Paint on It with Scary in a few weeks, where I'm going to be painting this and telling the story behind this bust. But anyway, is glazing. And I didn't really know what glazing was, but basically it's like a very thin layer of color, very thinned out layer of color that you can then use to blend and glaze over transitions to make them smoother. And you wouldn't think that it works because it's like barely any color, but when you watch these guys doing it in the videos, and it's just like 1 minute it's like 2 blocks of clearly demarcated paints that are not blended, and then the next minute it's like a beautiful blend, and you're like, well, that's crazy. And it's just a little bit of glaze, blow on it, a little bit of glaze, blow on it, and it's like, whoa, now that looks fantastic. It's like, it's really quite interesting. And so when I actually tried to start doing it, I was like, wow, that actually works. And it's not even difficult. I mean, you just have to get the dilution and you just kind of whack it on and blow on it. So glazing is really, really cool technique, and you can use it on your tiny miniatures too, although you might not find that you need spend that much time on it, but
it's good for cloaks if you want to tone down your high highlights and your low highlights. You just glaze the middle part.
Or for sure, if you're trying to paint non-metallic metal and stuff like that, like you're going to be doing glazing and stuff like that. So that was a cool technique that I'm still working on. Okay, so coming towards the end, who do you get inspiration from? Or where or what? But yeah,
I watch a lot of Warhammer related YouTube content, both painting videos and battle reports, and I find inspiration there. So I'll give you a practical example. My Harlequin army, which is another one of those pandemic armies that I painted recently, I was watching Tabletop Titans, and Adrian's Harlequin army really popped on camera, and I really loved that blue and magenta thing that his army had going on. So I decided I want something like that for my army. Now, I didn't take his exact paint recipe, but I found the inspiration there. And then I went to my paint collection and I found a paint by P3 called Murderous Magenta. And I went, that sounds perfect for Harlequins. And then I think it's Adriatic Blue by Scale 75. And I just ended up banging out my Harlequin army in that blue and magenta scheme. But I totally stole it from Tabletop Titans.
Yeah, because often, like, if you find the scheme and then you can find out like what colors that they use, then you end up buying those 1 or 2 paints from that range, and then you're like, oh, that's really cool, and then you end up getting more paints from the range, and that's how you get into a new range, right?
Yeah, for me, I already own enough paints that I just went to my paint collection and went, what bright magenta and bright blue do I own that I could use for that?
Do you have any particular painters or artists that you follow, Francois?
I mean, I follow quite a few that come to mind right now as like a big influence on my painting. I unfortunately am blanking, but it's kind of a thing where I'll watch a lot of painting videos and they all kind of blur together and the techniques mix in my head. So unfortunately, you could take me a little bit by surprise there with that question. It wasn't in our show notes, I don't think. But I don't have a name to give.
All right,
you.
Nick.
It's pulling a Nick.
Miniac. Sorry, that's who I was thinking about. I love Miniac.
Yeah,
Check
Miniac's good. Yeah.
Miniac. I think originally when I got back to the hobby, like whatever many years ago, Kenny Boucher on Next Level Painting was somebody that I followed a lot, just because I found he's really good at showing the use of contrast in your army and how that that really makes your army pop. Lately, yeah, Miniac, there's Squidmar, but I think the two bigger
Squidmar,
ones, the two bigger ones right now is Marco Frazzoni. Lately is the one I've been following quite a bit, and actually most recently, and I unfortunately don't know his name, but his YouTube channel is called 52 Miniatures. And I'm on his site now, and it's like 20,000 subscribers. But I remember, was not too long ago, I feel like there was 500 subscribers. Like he didn't have a lot of views, and I was like, I don't understand why this guy doesn't have a lot of views. Like they're well produced videos. And like he's not like an Angel Heraldez, like Golden Demon, but he's somebody that is not afraid to explore and experiment in painting and go through his steps really well and try. And anyway, so I've really enjoyed his content. 52 Miniatures on YouTube. Definitely check him out.
All right. So more to do with kind of getting into bust painting this year and expanding my horizon. So the first person who really helped me do that was Marco. And I was actually a painting client of his. I mean, so these people do coaching, right? And so I transitioned from playing coaching, because nobody's playing, to painting coaching, because that was my hobby goal last year, was to improve my painting. And so Marco's channel, though, like that's what got me into oils and the inks and all that stuff. Was all Marco. So big shout out to Marco Frazzoni. I think his Not Just Mecca, I think is the name of his.
Yeah, Not Just Mecca.
So do check out his channel if you want to expand your horizons. Great Italian accent, love it. And his videos are really well produced. It's very clear what he's doing. Some of these painting videos, like you can't see shit, right? Like. So it's very well produced, well lit, clear videos, concise instructions, and he really explains why he does things really well, actually. So Marco is definitely one of them. I mentioned Ben Comets already. Obviously, Ben is one of the most amazing painters, and so he's the guy I've been looking at for techniques for bust painting and larger miniature painting. Although the first miniature that I started watching from him was him painting ultramarine. Horus Heresy Ultramarine, and using just blue, black, and glazes or something like that. And then I found his the larger bust and stuff that he does, and learned these other techniques. But yeah, so Ben Comets is one of my big inspirations. And then the other person I follow on Instagram a lot, just to see and be amazed by the painting, is not really. I guess it kind of inspires me that maybe in some future altered universe I might be able to paint like that. But just to see what people can do with paints on a miniature is a guy called Sergio Calvio. And it's just like, you can't believe that these are like paint jobs on miniatures. Like they're just so ultra amazing. But anyway, and you know what I found is, if you want to have like a painting coach with one of these guys, and I think there's value in that for sure. They're all European. Many of them are European, and so the time difference makes coaching very difficult, which is a problem. But anyway, those are kind of my inspirations.
Some honorable mentions. One would be Vince Venturella.
Oh, yeah,
Venturella. Yeah, I find, and they recently, Warhammer Community had the Sigvald, had a bunch of different painters paint Sigvald. And people can argue all day, who had the more technically sound, but I found the one that immediately caught my eye was Vince Venturilla's Sigvald. I was blown away. I was like, that, I would pay for that.
He has some really neat little quick tip videos too that can just help you get over certain problems that you're having.
Yeah, definitely. He's your go-to person if you want paint reviews, because he owns it all. He owns everything. And so Vince Venturella would be the one.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many good channels out there. Obviously, like Angel Heraldez. So the funny thing about watching some of his videos, obviously, because he speaks mostly Spanish, but the videos are dubbed over by some dude with an English speaking English. Yeah. So it's kind of interesting, because then he's talking like Angel. Oh, I do this. So it's kind of listening to Angel, but not really. So obviously, he did one wet blending video on a troll belly, and it was just it was really good.
Yeah. I know
He
that
just
one you're
took two
talking about. Yeah.
blotches of completely different paint, and the next thing you know, it's like beautifully blended. It's like really cool. But okay, so finishing off here, guys. So we were asked, and we will go to the questions in a second, but to tell people what our favorite model that we painted was, and I guess like favorite in terms of how like you feel like you painted it well, as opposed to just a favorite model. So do you guys have one?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
So I did not pick my best painted model because, despite what Nick says, I am able to spend hours and hours and actually paint beautiful miniature. But
Never seen it. Never seen
Deny
it.
ability.
I actually
Yeah.
I actually take more pride in what is apparently my shtick now, which is banging out lots of miniatures that look really good, like Tabletop Plus, but very quickly. And I think the best ever model that I've painted following that recipe is my Silent King model. Now, anyone who owns a Silent King knows how intricate that model is and how annoying it is to assemble. And I swear to God, I spent more time putting that model together than I spent painting it. Now, for those of you that are watching on YouTube, I'm putting the model in front of my camera now. But for the rest of you, it's basically my Frost Necron scheme with gold highlights, and this took me about 2 hours from start to finish to paint. And it's 98% airbrush. There's maybe 10 minutes of brushwork on there. And basically, this is 5 colors. There's 5 paints. That's it. I started from a black primer with a dark metallic from Vallejo O'Hare. I forget which one it is, but it's the one that's basically bull gun metal. And I coated the entire miniature in that bull gun metal. Then I went to a lighter silver, and I just zenithed it from the top. So I just sprayed the lighter metal color from the top. After that, I went to I think it's called Magic Blue, again from Vallejo Air, but it's one of those bright blues. And I did all the weapons, and I did the little menhirs thing, and I did the exhaust from the back, and the glowy orb, and the katan that's at the top of the chair with that blue. Then I added a little bit of white to that blue, and I highlighted it just with the airbrush, and then a little bit more white, did it again. And I finished, still with the airbrush, with Scale 75 Elven Gold on the back menhirs and all the gold parts and the cape. And then at the very end, I just did a little bit of gold detail with a brush. And that's it. And this giant Necron model took about 2 hours from start to finish. And from 4 feet away, it looks really,
Marco
really
would
good.
be proud of you, actually, Brunswick, because he's into speed painting, too.
Yeah. I'll give you this. If I'm in a situation and there's a GT in 2 weeks and I have a 2,000 points of gray plastic, I'll pay him to paint the army to have it ready because I know he'll have it ready. He'll have it
and
ready.
you'll get your 10 points for painting.
That's right.
All right. How about you, Nick?
I'm cheating, so I'm using 2.
Totally cheating.
So my favorite model happens to be, I enjoy the painting, is my Lord of Change. Okay. I love the Lord of Change, and I like this one because this was one where I'm classically a painter that paints really dark models and gritty. So for him, I really tried to force myself to go with the bright colors, bright contrasting colors, and he's really stands out. I get a lot of compliments on him, and to be honest, if you look at him, it's not a lot of complicated techniques. There's no really wet blending on him. There's, there's like harsher brush strokes for highlights and whatever. But it's just one of those situations where you can see that you don't always need to go super complicated to have something to come out well, especially depending on what textures you're playing with. Like, for example, the harsh brush strokes, he's a bird. So that worked well with the feathers, right? It actually really sold the look on the feathers a lot better, and I've had that compliment. So Lord of Change. My second favorite is actually, this is, I think, Voldus. It's been a while since I played my Grey Knights, and I like him because...
Some young guy.
Yeah.
some
Grey Knight.
Yeah, some Grey
Knight.
Yeah, and I really like him because the Grey Knights and him especially are the first army where I've really green stuff, sculpted the base. Well, not sculpted, I used a roller, but you know what I mean. Sculpted the base with a lot of different elements. And then this was the one that had wet blending. These were the army where I really put a lot of effort into, but also the planning. And it just shows to me a little bit, when you first started the hobby and you went into a Games Workshop and you saw the glass case of miniatures and you're like, I'll never be able to paint like that. This was the one where I'm like, man, they'd be lucky to have a miniature like this in their case. So it was just to me like a moment of pride, like, okay, I've leveled up, like I can paint a little bit like that. So those are the two I picked.
Mine is Nagash. So Nagash is one of the very few AOS models I still own now because I got rid of almost all my AOS. And so but I kept Nagash because he's my pride and joy. It's probably not even my best paint job, but he was my first big model like this. He was the first model I airbrushed. Shout out to Ryan Pippy for showing me how to use the airbrush that night. And I spent 3 or 4 months painting this thing, which is unheard of. And I spent like weeks putting like 2,000 skulls on the base from those stupid GW skull boxes. And so a freehand on the book with like the stupid ghost coming out, and so that's my favorite. My second would be like my big AOS monsters that I kept also. So I only have 4 AOS models left now, but so Nagash, my man Nagash. And when I was actually able to actually play with him for a short period of time in AOS, that was really cool. Okay. So before we go to questions, what are you guys working on right now?
So uncharacteristically, I'm actually working in an army that I'm putting a lot of effort and time in.
Get out!
And I went back. I believe I've said this on the pod before, but I went back to my first love when I started playing 40K in 1994. That was 2nd edition. My first army was Dark Angels. That army was sold a long time ago. But before the new rules came out, I'd like to point that out, started a new Dark Angels project.
Just like the Harlequins and the Whites, all before the new rules.
No, those were me jumping on the bandwagon. The Dark Angels was a happy accident. But I now have 2,000 points of Deathwing painted because I started with the Terminators from my youth. That was the unit that was the most iconic thing that I ever owned as a teenager in the 90s. And I actually spent quite a lot of time on each and every model, and I fully painted the banner on my Deathwing Ancient, and I'm having a lot of fun actually putting in the time. Now, that's for the Deathwing. I'm currently painting my Ravenwing. My Ravenwing are getting banged out like to tabletop standard in about a week. But the Deathwing, they look fantastic. And I even got like resin bases for
Ravenwing's
them.
just
They'll be my
black and that's it, done.
Well, to be fair, my Ravenwing are primer, gray highlights, and like red multi-meltas on my attack dice, and that's pretty much it. But the Terminators, they look ace.
All right, Nick, what are you working on?
The evil version
of Deathwing, which is Death Guard.
List. I'm playing Death Guard, but all Terminators. So I got 25 Terminators. I already have like a bunch painted, but I think I still have like 10 or something or 9 of them to paint, plus some extra kind of Death Guard models. So those will be my next.
So I have 2 projects going on simultaneously. One is resurrecting my old Dark Angels army. Of course, if you follow this channel long enough, you know I painted a crap ton of old Marines for Lion's Blade Strike Force back in 7th, and maybe like 10,000 points of Ravenwing at that time. And so now that I actually started this before the book came out because they finally came back in stock, the Cenobium Forge World Dark Angels dudes, the Terminators. And so they came back in stock, so I'm like, shit, I haven't owned a single Deathwing model ever because Deathwing was shit before. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to buy these and make some Deathwing. And then the book came out and they're like, oh, Deathwing. I'm like, oh, sweet. So I got these dudes and I'm converting up a whole bunch of Forge World guys for Blade Guard vets. And I'm going to repaint a unit of my Black Knights because I'm not happy with the paint I did on them back then because I can paint better now. My Primaris Azrael conversion, and so it's kind of a labor of love again with resurrecting my Dark Angels army. And the other thing I'm doing, of course, starting in a few weeks live, will be working on Uncle Number 4. I love my Asian themed Asian uncle.
So let me get this straight. You started a bust over a year ago, which you never finished, and now you're starting another bust.
So should I go into that quick story? Okay, so the quick story is I was getting into bust painting and I didn't know what bust to buy. I really like samurais, And so I bought the Samurai bust from CanHammer. And then around the same time, right after I bought it, because it took like 4 months to get here, right at the pitch of the pandemic, I saw one of Ben Comet's videos painting Uncle Number 4 bust. And I'm like, fuck, that'd be awesome. I could paint this dude who looks like my uncle. And so I'm like, where did he get it? And it's from a sculptor in Hong Kong. And so I messaged the guy, and he only made like 3 or 4 of them, and he had 1 left. And so I'm like, I'll take it. And it wasn't even expensive, right? The shipping was more expensive than the model. And so he packaged it up and sent it by like some dude rowing on a boat across the ocean, because it took 6 months to get here, and it arrived on Chinese New Year, like, a few weeks ago, which was hilarious. It's Chinese New Year, and then like this box arrives from Hong Kong, and it's like the packaging is amazing. I'll show the people on the stream, but it's got a mesh bag, and it has a box with Chinese calligraphy on it that has my name on it and inscriptions, and the model itself is amazing sculpt, and it's got his brand on the back, which is like an old Chinese brand, and so it's really cool. And so the minute I got that, I like dropped the Samurai.
And so in a year, you can look forward to seeing pictures of a half-finished bust when Darren moves on to the next one.
And the other thing is, actually, so
some guy in Nepal is gonna have.
Yeah, so I have access to Ben Comet's entire video on how he painted this. Like, it's like 3 hours long. And so I'm just going to try and copy it to learn techniques and mixing and stuff like that. So I'm just going to try and copy it straight up and reproduce what he did and see how it looks at the end. So that's the other thing that flummoxed me with the Samurais. I didn't know how to paint. I didn't know what colors. I didn't know, like, there's no guide to it, right? And it's a pretty complicated model. Whereas this is just a dude, his skin, and that's it. So it's kind of like a nice basic place to start. So the Samurai was probably biting off more than I could handle at the time. So I will go back to the Samurai at some point, or I'll commission Nick to paint it. Okay, let's go to Discord. We have a few questions, and then we'll be done. All right, so blah, 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 blah. Wrong channel.
One for that.
Okay.
That beautiful sound coming out of Darren's voice.
Okay. Want to talk about that? Up your painting game. We already talked about that. Favorite brands. How do you safely use super glue without gluing your thumbs together?
You don't.
Carefully.
Yeah, I glued mine together just today.
You could wear gloves, especially if you're using the accelerant. You got to be really careful not to then touch the super glue, because it's just.
Whenever I glue models, I end up with like super glue residue on my fingers, and I just bite it off.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. What are some techniques for dry fitting, testing out poses before gluing? So that especially like for these multi-positional dreadnoughts and stuff like that. Some blue tack sometimes.
Blue tack, yeah. Or just YOLO and just do it.
Just do it.
Yeah, just get in there, just glue it.
So I probably could do a whole hobby episode on how to mess with Forge World, because there's some real separate techniques for messing with Forge World resin. We could probably do that at some point.
And all 3 of the people that can afford Forge World will be watching.
That's right. If it's in stock.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Recipes for hair and skin. That's kind of beyond the scope of this podcast right now, but we could do a cast on that at some point. Okay. Paint a lot. Heavy experiment. Okay. With heavy art paints, art acrylics, stuff like that. So actually a good question to talk about paints like the CanHammer colors, which are like pure pigment acrylic paints. So this like high pigment count, it's a super thick paint. Like it comes out and it's like, thick and really good for mixing. Obviously, there's only 9 colors. So you got to mix all your colors. It's great coverage. So people swear by these paints, and they're very hard to get. So things like that, or Scale 75 make heavy body acrylic paint line as well. I have a box here, for example, which I have still shrink wrapped, as you can see, unopened. So I think if you want to experiment with those kind of paints, I think you would be pleasantly surprised at what they can do, but it just takes time, and
Just buy a pot or two and try it out. Don't buy a full paint set until you know what that paint set can do. This is something that I've done in the past. I decided to buy the entire Vallejo range, and it worked out for me because I really like the Vallejo paints. But in hindsight, maybe I should have bought one or two, played around with them, and then committed.
Okay. Next question. So I'm going to twist the question a little bit. Is there an army that you, money no object, time no object, you would buy right now just because you want to paint it?
Ooh.
Forget about playing. You don't ever have to play it. Doesn't matter how good it is.
Well, I own like 10 different
Okay,
armies.
so you got them all already.
It's a hard question for me. So
me
Deathcore or
with
Krieg?
Krieg.
Krieg.
Yeah.
Krieg. Because it's prohibitively expensive. And I'm a big fan of Imperial Guard, and I'm a big fan of the like German trench look of the Krieg. So I guess that'd be my answer.
Okay. Nick?
Me probably troll army.
Ah,
from
that was
Age of
my answer
Sigmar.
too.
Just because that. Oh really? Yeah. Just because I'd like to experiment with like the different colors and make them look whimsical and stuff like
Or
that.
was
Yeah.
it trolls? Like, what's the army with like the big Minotaur dude and like the guy who holds a boulder up, like the big beastman?
Oh,
Cygor?
Beastmen?
Yeah,
Yeah,
Beastmen.
that's what I'm thinking of. Beastmen. Or trolls would be good too, like the trolls, those cave trolls and stuff. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, that would be cool. I think you could do a lot with the skin and stuff like that. Like, and really in 40K, you don't have a lot of armies where there's just a whole bunch of skin.
Yeah.
You heard it here first, folks. If you like skin, go
Exactly,
Age of
right?
Sigmar.
Skin, fur, cloth.
Need a Knights of
Whereas
Sladesh.
40K is a lot of armor and stuff like that, right? So,
Just wish they were all naked.
okay, and final question from Thurgood. So, any tips for maybe a top tip from each of us for assembling, clipping, and cleaning the models? He says it's his least favorite part of the hobby. I actually find assembling models quite just quietly therapeutic without the pressure of painting. But some people I understand hate that. So, any top tip for that kind of thing?
Yeah, I hate assembling models too. I don't have any tips. It sucks. You could pay somebody, but then
Pay
it's going to come
somebody, that's
back
your
and they're going
tip.
to do it wrong.
So my tip, because I'm also not a huge fan of assembly, I watch videos while I assemble. So I just sit at my computer and I have my snips and my X-Acto knife and my glue, and I put a battle report or something in the background and I just check out and just do it, because it's a very mechanical, repetitive kind of thing. Just snip off the sprue, clean off the mold line, glue the bit A to bit B. It doesn't require brain power, so just put on a show.
Especially now with like all these press fit stuff and yeah. Now
Well, I mean, you say that, but like the Silent King is one of the most recent models they ever did, and it's probably the most infuriating thing I've
have
ever
you ever
assembled.
assembled a fire raptor though?
I have not.
Then you do not know infuriating.
Trying to get the steps right on this Silent King, like where he's like stepping down the steps, I don't know what they were thinking when they designed that kit. It looks good now, but it took me hours.
Yeah, it's weird
to put
because
together.
their designs are pretty good these days. Like some of these models you put together, are like wow, like that was intricate yet strange.
Eliminators Srezra. Anyway,
Srezra,
that guy.
say.
Thank you, from the Necron range. Also a nightmare to assemble.
Maybe it's just Necrons. All right, my top
Necrons.
tip. Actually, I'm going to shout out GW on these two tools. The clipper, the GW clipper, so good for clipping GW shit. And this thing goes through Forge World gates as well, like chomp, like really goes through. So this clipper, this is my third one now, because eventually they do warp, but they do last a long time. It's like so good for like clipping things. I don't know, it's just perfect for what it's designed for. It's a bit expensive, but it lasts you a while, and it's really good, and you don't have to X-Acto your finger off. Second thing is the GW scraper tool thingy for mold lines and stuff. It's actually really good. It stays sharp, but it's not going to cut you like a knife. And it's great exactly for what it does, which is to scrape mold lines and those little bits that get left over after clipping. And And actually, these days with the newer models, they really hide their lines in places where you probably don't even need to scrape them anymore. But occasionally, you still get new models that have the piece that's stuck right in the middle of the shoulder pad, or like in the middle of the forehead, so they still have models that have unfortunate placements of sprue bits, but a lot of their mold lines and stuff are quite hidden these days. So, but still, that's again probably overpriced for what it is. But one of these lasts you for, this is the only one I've ever owned since I started playing again, and it just scrapes stuff well because that's what it's designed to do.
Just use your hobby knife and play chicken with your thumb.
Yeah, that's what I do.
I'm
a
surgeon. I can't live that dangerously. So,
I have bled over models multiple times.
Part of some of my.
Then you don't need to buy blood for the blood god technical paint. You just use your own blood.
That's right.
Okay, well, that is the end of our hobby show. Thank you very much, everybody, for watching. We hope you enjoyed that. Actually, if you want us to do more hobby shows, and maybe for one of these two gentlemen to produce hobby content, then do let us know in the comments or message us. I did do hobby back in the day, but it just took up a lot of time, and I don't have that much time anymore. But certainly we can try and accommodate if people want to see that kind of content. We can certainly do that, and we can certainly throw on a hobby podcast every so often and talk about, maybe go more in depth in something specific, like this kind of paint or this technique or whatever. I don't know. But if people want that kind of content, let us know. We can definitely do that. So thanks for watching, guys. Thank you, Francois, Nick, for joining us tonight, as usual. And everybody get your hobby on. Stay safe out there. And we'll see you guys next time.